an indelible impression. We're going to talk more about that after 10 o'clock this morning. Your messages welcome. Also on the next subject as well, almost half of NHS England maternity wards turned away expectant mums last year. New figures show today. One hospital was closed to mums-to-be 33 times, mostly because there weren't enough staff, a problem seen across the country. The figures show that 46% of maternity units couldn't offer their services to patients on a total of 282 occasions. And even though that number is a drop on the previous year, in part due to the closures of maternity wards, the proportion of trusts turning away patients has increased. Campaigners have argued that cuts to maternity services and midwife-led only units are in some cases threatening the safety of mothers and babies alike. We can talk to Labour MP and their Shadow Health Secretary, Jonathan Ashworth. Labour put in the Freedom of Information request that revealed these figures today. Also with us, Keith Strangewood, who is the chair of the Keep Horton General campaign. Alice Watkin is with us. Alice gave birth 3 weeks ago, and Peggy Woodward is a retired midwife. Thank you all very much for talking to us. John Ashworth, how do you react to the fact that almost half of maternity units were forced to temporarily close their doors last year?
Oh, I think these are appalling statistics. I mean, the birth of a child is a moment of great joy and celebration and love, but it's also understandably a moment of anxiety for a mother going, or a woman going into labour. And can you imagine being turned away from a maternity unit when you're in the throes of labour, sort of being pushed from pillar to post, sometimes having to travel 20 miles with all the fear and anxiety that you'll go into labour or you'll have your birth in the back of the car or at the side of the road? That is not good for the mother's safety and well-being. It's certainly not good for the newborn baby's safety and well-being. And this is because of years of cuts and financial squeeze in the NHS. Means we haven't got enough midwives in the NHS. We've seen cuts to the numbers of beds in the NHS. And I really think this is an atrocious set of statistics. And I hope the ministers, the health minister, apologises to every mother who's been turned away, or every woman who's been turned away from a maternity unit when they've gone into labour. I think it's absolutely terrible.
I'll come back to you with what the government's saying in a moment, but I could see, Alice, you gave birth 3 weeks ago. You were nodding in agreement with some of what Jonathan Ashworth was saying. Congratulations, but do explain to our audience about the journey, the 45-minute journey to give birth. Why?
Well, our local hospital, the Horton, has been downgraded to a midwife-only unit. It's my first baby, so my husband and I were a bit concerned about being at a midwife-only unit where there's no doctors. So we had to choose between two hospitals that are nowhere near our house. And it's a good job we did in the end, because my son had to be born by emergency caesarean, which obviously is not possible at a midwife-led unit. So, yeah, we just had to choose between Oxford, which is very difficult to get to, or Warwick, which is actually a different county and a different NHS trust. So it was a very poor choice between the two, really, because of the downgrade of our local hospital. And
Keith Strangewood, you are chair of Keep the Horton General campaign. Presumably it's stories like Alice's which are motivating you to fight to keep maternity services at Horton General in Banbury.
We have documented cases that we've got horror stories. We have a mother on the side of the road in a car giving birth. We have a grandmother delivering a grandchild. We had a child born on the way to Oxford in a supermarket car park. But I was listening to John Ashworth, and we need to throw politics aside here and focus on the issue. And it's about, we're not a third world country. We shouldn't be having things like this happen. There's nothing worse than losing a life, but a life that's been led to lose is bad enough. But a new life is something that we must not and should not allow to happen. And this is what is happening at the Horton because of the transfers to the JR.
What, sorry, are you're not saying that babies have died as a result, are you?
The Trust aren't admitting that there has been any never events, but we have documented evidence of almost never events. But I personally was involved in one of these events where we now have a child that's got life-changing disabilities, which is going to cost the NHS millions and millions. And this whole thing was about £2.2 million that the clinical commissioning group wanted to save.
OK. They would reject what you have just said. I'm going to go back to John Ashworth to tell you what the government say For a start, you know they've announced an increase, a 25% increase in midwifery training places. And they go on to say, temporary closures in NHS maternity units are well-rehearsed safety measures which trusts use to safely manage peaks in admissions. Because, as you know, they're unable to plan the exact time and place of birth, and there are occasions when a unit cannot safely accept more women into their care. And therefore, they say, to use these figures in the way that you have is disingenuous.
But what we're seeing is a greater proportion of trusts shutting their maternity units. And the reason why is because we have such a chronic shortage of midwives and other trained clinicians working in these units. We're short of 3,500 midwives. Now, look, if the government recruit more midwives, I will congratulate them and I will celebrate that. But I remember David Cameron telling us we were going to have 3,000 more midwives, and they broke their promise. It didn't materialise. We're short of 3,500 midwives in this country. That could get even worse if we don't get a Brexit deal which safeguards all the EU staff who work in our hospitals as well. So yes, I hear what the government are saying, but the reason they're closing these units is because they don't have the staff and they don't have the capacity, they don't have the beds. We've seen 14,000 beds cut across our hospitals in the last 8 years. So they're taking these decisions as a safety precaution, and in the circumstances, I understand that. But there's a reason for the circumstances, and the reason the circumstances are as they are is because of years of underfunding, years of cuts to beds, and a failure to invest and recruit the midwives we need for the future.
Which they say they are changing 20 billion a year more by 2023-24. I want to bring in Peggy, if I can, Peggy Woodward, who is a retired midwife. I wonder what changes you've seen over the years. Peggy, good morning.
Good morning. I'm sorry, I'm having difficulty hearing very clearly the links. But my career spanned in the NHS about 48 years. I retired last year, and I have seen the changes I've seen have been particularly started in the 80s when units were closed, or as they called it in those days, amalgamated. So we lost beds, and also the underfunding, the fragmentation of the NHS, which accelerated in 2012.
OK. Alice, what impact, I wonder if you could tell our audience what impact it's had on you and the birth of your son, your first child, having to make that journey because it wasn't possible to have it at your local maternity unit?
Well, it's had a massive impact on us, and especially after I got home after my cesarean, I needed to go back into hospital to be seen by the doctors because I became very unwell, and at my local hospital, the Horton, I was diagnosed with sepsis. But because the maternity unit had been downgraded, I couldn't receive the treatment I needed there. So I had to be transferred in an ambulance with a life-threatening condition to a different county, a different hospital, a different NHS trust, basically a different part of the country, to receive the treatment I needed to save my life with a 6-day-old baby in tow. And it had a massive impact on us, and it was very scary that day. And if we had been able to go to our local unit, like we could before it was downgraded, then that would have made a huge difference.
Right. And Peggy, how do you react to these figures from this Freedom of Information request put in by Labour today?
I think those figures are the tip of the iceberg, because I know from experience over the last few years that even when the units aren't closed to admissions, there's a lot of work struggling to stop closure by sending women home as soon as possible, which impacts on their care.
Mm. John Ashworth, if Labour win the next general election, what would you do about the vacancies when it comes to midwives? Would you, for example, restore the nurses' student bursary?
Absolutely, because we need to be training midwives. The government sadly got rid of the training bursary, and we've seen applications fall as a consequence. We need more midwives. We're short of 3,500 midwives. We're obviously short of nearly 40,000 nurses as well across the NHS. And actually, we're 100,000 vacancies across the NHS as a whole. But we need to be training midwives and nurses now. So we'd bring back that bursary as a first step. And of course, we would give the NHS more funding. It's been squeezed so much under these last 8 years. Parts of it have been sold off and privatised as well. Would end that privatisation agenda, which has been going on these last few years in the NHS, which Peggy referred to since 2012, which has accelerated it. And we'll bring the NHS, the services back together. So rather than this fragmented system that we've got, we would bring services back together. But
are you promising to match that?
Got to start putting the.
Are you promising? Sorry to interrupt, but are you promising to match that?
Yeah,
20.5 billion?
We're matching that, and we're going beyond that. We're matching that funding, and we would go beyond that, because that funding is more than it's had under the Tories, but it's not enough. It's only enough for the NHS to stand still, and I want the NHS to be the best healthcare system in the world. I want to give every child the very best start in life. I'm passionate about improving health outcomes for this country's children, and that starts with investment in maternity services.
Okay. I just want to ask you, Mr Ashworth, if I may, a couple brief more questions about Labour. You're on Jeremy Corbyn's top team. How close is Labour to adopting as official policy offering people a referendum on the final Brexit deal Mrs May comes back from Brussels with?
Well, I mean, what we've said is that the priority for now has to be getting a good deal that puts family prosperity first, that puts jobs first, that puts the NHS first.
Sure. The question was how close would you say?
Right.
How close is Labour to offering people a second referendum?
Look, well, we hope we can get a deal, but we've said that all options should remain on the table if the government can't get a deal and Parliament cannot agree on what the next step should be. So we're saying keep everything on the table, but the priority for the coming days and weeks is absolutely trying to get a deal. And it doesn't look like Theresa May can get a deal, by the way. I think she's pretty much mishandled it. That seems to be the consensus. But, she's got until October to convince us that she can get that deal.
And finally, how seriously do you take reports that a number of Labour MPs who are so fed up with your leader's approach to Brexit and the way he's dealt with the many anti-Semitism controversies, that they are planning splitting from Labour and forming a new party?
Well, I hope they're not, because, look, the reality is...
Well, how seriously do you take the reports, though?
If you want to radically change... Well, I would say if any colleague is thinking of setting up some new SDP Mark II, like we had some colleagues, Labour MPs did that in the 80s, well, they didn't get anywhere, did it? If you want to radically change the country, to improve the conditions for working class people, for people that we represent in our communities, to improve the NHS, to improve the schools that our children go to give people well-paid jobs which aren't temporary contracts, 0 hours contracts, you need a Labour government, a united Labour government. And the lesson of 1997 is, when we got a Labour government, we got it because we were united. It's because the country came together behind a united Labour Party. In the 80s, when the SDP and David Owen and Roy Jenkins and all that lot went off and created an alternative Labour Party, as they tried to do, it just sustained the Tories in power. So I've no idea. I mean, I know there's been all this gossip in the newspapers this summer. I've got no idea whether it's true or not, because I've been spending this August with my family. This is my sort of first day back doing sort of politics, if you like. But, look, the lesson in the 80s is this would only help the Tories. You're playing the Tory game if you go off and set up some sort of SDP Mark II party.
Thank you very much for your time this morning. Thank you, John Ashworth, Labour's Health Secretary. Keith Strangewood, thank you very much. We are awaiting a statement from Horton General in response to the claims that you made earlier. Alice, thank you for coming on the programme. Alice Watkin and retired midwife Peggy Woodward. Thank you for your time as well. Thank you very much. Coming up, protest.